Hi everyone. I think we should start. Well, yes, thank you. I'm very happy to moderate the session, which title is Borders Next to Us and Borders Within Us towards a new sociology of borderlands. And I think that topic is more and more important. The very idea of the session comes from Małgorzata Bieńkowska, who is with us, Magdalena Nowicka-Franczak, and Agnieszka Golczyńska-Grondas, who cannot be with us because of because of her health. And I am Katarzyna Waniek. And I would like to briefly introduce our guests and panelists. Maggie O'Neill, professor in sociology at the University of Cork. She has a long history of doing critical theory feminist research. And what is very important for me, conducting walking participatory and biographical methods. And now she's a prime investigator in a research project, Euro Border Walks, and one of 3 borders which are researched is Polish-Ukrainian one. The next guest is Dorte Jagetic Andersen, Associate Professor at the Center for Border Region Studies, Department of Political Science, University of Southern Denmark, with a background in European ethnology, continental philosophy, and political science. Her main research interest is in identity formation in areas influenced by geopolitically drawn borders. The only man among us, Jussi Laine, Associate Professor of Multidisciplinary Border Studies at the Karelian Institute of the University of Eastern Finland, also holding the title of Docent of Human Geography at the University of Oulu in Finland. He's a human geographer, yet in his approach to borders, he combines influences from international relations and geopolitics. Elżbieta Opiłowska, our next guest, Deputy Director for Research and International Cooperation, Director of the Center for Regional and Borderland Studies. Her research interests are sociology of borderlands and collective memory. Yeah, should I add something? And Marta Pietrusińska, last but not least. Marta Pietrusińska is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Education, University of Warsaw. Her main points of interest are critical migration studies at micro and meso levels, post-colonial approaches to migration research, migrants and humanitarian crises, and discourse on refugees and Muslim minorities. And we would like to focus our discussion on 3 main topics. The first one is meanings of borders, then emerging trends, tensions, and entanglements. And I would like to start with the first one, meanings. And the question is, what meanings are associated with the notion of border today in the modern world? And Maggie, I would like you to start.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. And it's great to be here on the panel with such wonderful experts. So I suppose that I started to think about borders and the meanings of borders pretty much at the beginning of my academic career, although I haven't gravitated to border studies, but rather have spent many years working in migration studies. But this invitation really made me think, and kind of about the relationship between, I suppose, my history as an academic working in very ethnographic ways with marginalized communities. So I suppose I'd like to start by saying, that borders are material, but they're also psychic and internalized, and symbolic. The philosopher Thomas Nail speaks about borders as indexical, that a border is an indexical question. And how, when, and where, and who make it are crucial. The fence, the wall, the checkpoint, the limit, the boundary. But also they share a common, I guess, a kind of common process, and that is that they serve an ordering function. And this, in my own work, is integral to territorialization, the Irish border in particular, the relationship between territorialization and identity formation, that this is, a process, not a thing. But then thinking back to my earlier work with women, migrants, people in the mid-90s arriving in the English East Midlands from Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then research with migrant moms and girls in London and children in Ireland, the importance of the everyday bordering. That the everyday bordering has become a major technology of control of social diversity and discourses on diversity, but also it threatens the kind of convivial coexistence of pluralist societies. And I think, we situate that. I mean, as an example, I don't know whether you're following the news in London, but there was a huge march of fascist organisation, following Tommy Robinson. And there was something like 110,000 people turned up for this march. About a fifth of the size of the march were pro-Palestine marchers. But what was interesting is that the police, were focused on the people who were protesting in support of Palestine because of the prescription on protesting for Palestine by the British government, which is incredible. But this kind of, the kind of everyday borders, but also the way everyday borderings in our lives, in the lives of migrant moms and girls, but also the way that the state has stepped in this particular case to prescribe a protest group, which has led to many hundreds of people being arrested, mostly over retirement age. So I think the everyday borderings, but this, of course, is set within Europeanization, restrictive asylum policy, geopolitical changes, and what Zygmunt Bauman calls negative globalization. The heightened security concerns about unregulated migration, which really fueled the Brexit vote in England, and subsequently the kind of history of the prescription of people who are protesting in support of Palestine. But also, the kind of the mediatization of asylum seekers, the scapegoating of asylum seekers, and this, the UK immigration legislation, from the external territorial border to the internal border, is described by subsequent governments as a hostile environment. So there are the hostile environment is a policy; it's a government policy, which incorporates technologies of everyday bordering, in which ordinary citizens are demanded to become either border guards and or suspected illegitimate border crossers. And so we see this withdrawal of humanizing practices since Brexit, a lack of space for self-representation, filled by racism, misrecognition and violence. And the clashes last Saturday were incredibly violent. And so I think, whilst we don't want to sort of, I guess, go too far in terms of what we mean by the border. I think the everyday borderings that are happening currently are really scary. In terms of flags that are being painted on, kind of roads in England, attacks against anyone who is of colour or suspected of being of colour. Just really, it's very, very scary. And it isn't just in England, it's also happening in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. And coming back, and I'll say more about the Irish situation later, but I think what was really pertinent in our project was to discover that the loyalists and the sort of nationalists are joining forces and sewing the British and the Irish flag together in a display of authoritarian strength against, as an anti-immigration gesture, as a pro-nationalist gesture. And so I think these are they're really scary, troubled times. So for me, the kind of this concept of everyday bordering, and I guess it's how far we go with that, really. But that's for me a really important point to start with in terms of the meanings of the notion of the border today.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to add one thing because when thinking about the topic, we have that, I think, that idea in mind that we lived for years in the belief that the borders, at least in our part of the world, are disappearing. And now something different is going on, and we can see it, I think, even here, right? That they are strengthened and armed, and violence is a very important issue in all of it. Okay, thank you very much. Dorte, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And yeah, I would also firstly say thank you for inviting me for the Congress. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I also think that it's a privilege for us border scholars that we are able to speak to different kinds of audiences and not just to our own community. Because maybe I should say that I also feel a little bit as if I'm kind of crashing a party, which is also something that is related to borders, right? Because I'm not a sociologist, and I'm maybe also an academic who doesn't really define myself in terms of a discipline. So I have a lot of different disciplinary backgrounds. And because of that, this kind of tight-knit community that is the sociological community also feels a little bit like a strong identity as against my own academic identity, which is also about borders. But I would call myself a border scholar, and I would also call myself a critical border scholar. I'm actually a head of a research center, and the research we do are in border regions. So the kind of borders that we are concerned with in our research center are like borderlands and border regions. So the kinds of regions that are located close to some kind of state border. So of course there's a lot of like sociological bordering as well involved in the research that we are doing, but it's mostly connected with this like traditional notion of the border, which is the state border, right? But as a critical border scholar, I'm trying to always escape this container, the state container, right? And trying to look at the way in which borders are not just practiced in the light of the state border, but they are actually also practiced very much beyond the state border in borderlands and in border regions. So they are also practiced in terms of culture. They're practiced in terms of historical processes that are somehow very far away from what we would like from the center see as a border or how a border should be done. I think one of the fascinating things about studying borderlands and border regions is that they're often very particular places with very particular cultural practices going on. And I think this is one of the things that we are focused on in our in our research center, right? The significance of these lands that are somehow placed close to a state border. But I would also say, and this relates to what you've already been saying, that I think that most of us critical border scholars, we are actually quite devastated with what is going on at the moment and the developments that we are looking at around, not just in Europe, but around the world today when we are talking about state borders, because it seems as if everything is now about securitization. It seems as if we are returning to some kind of one-sided and very exclusive notion of borders, kind of again. We were hoping actually that European integration and some of the things that have been happening in Europe would have kind of been able to deal with some of this, but now it appears as if this understanding of the border, the state border, as a line in the sand, like the very modernist imaginary of borders, have really returned again, at least in established politics. So borders are again these like divisions separating us and them for the sake of ownership of land, and some say for the sake of security, but this is really doubtful if it's creating security or if it's doing exactly the opposite, right? And as basis for identity and identity constructions, mostly related to nationalism, to ethnic identities, right? We see a lot of this today. And as I said, this is a border imaginary that we have hoped would have been challenged at least a little bit from what has been happening over the last 20, 30 years in a European context, but also in other places. But it seems as if the recourse to this like one-sided notion of what a border is really something that has become extremely powerful. The discourses of securitization that we are looking at that emphasize this modernist border imaginary, they are also very, very reluctant to actually take the borderlands and the border regions into consideration. This border imaginary is something that is very much done from the perspective of the center and very far away from the borderlands and very far away from the people that are actually living in the borderlands. This is also something that's, I think, as a critical border scholar, we think is very devastating. How you can actually, sit in the center or at a desk almost and dictate what is happening for people in these borderlands with the securitization, which has come very much like this, right? So there's a clear return to a modernist imaginary in the way that we are bordering at the moment, and also return to a very, I think, authoritarian way of thinking about the state and what makes up a state. And I think also when talking about this with sitting at the center and deciding for the borderlands what the border should look like, I think it's also a kind of a colonial behavior, a return to a colonial behavior. Again, you're sitting at a desk and then you're drawing lines and deciding, okay, this is what should be done. So, yeah, not the most optimistic developments, and I think that even the social democratic governments in Europe are showing these same signs. Just look at what is happening in Denmark, right, where I come from.
Okay, thank you very much. Even if it is not so optimistic, but it's very important to notice it. And the discourse of securitization is also very typical for Polish discourse, I believe. So there is a lot of common, unfortunately, in this case. Okay, Jussi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. So thank you for the invitation the conference and this panel. It's nice to be the only man on the stage. It's not often the case. Also, I have to say that we agreed before this panel with Dorte that we are going to disagree on topics, because usually in these panels we just repeat the same thing. So I'm trying to change my notes accordingly. It's a little bit difficult to find something to disagree with, but at least I'm trying to make maybe a couple of points that have not been made up to now. I start by saying that borders, and especially borderlands, to me are laboratories of change. At borders and borderlands, we see many processes and phenomena much earlier and in much sharper relief than in the rest of the society. Borders are not in the margins anymore, but they have really found their way in the heart of politics and in the heart of public debate. I mean, open any TV channel, read any newspaper or podcast, it's basically about borders today. So this borderless world has become increasingly bordered. Physically, I mean, we have more borders now than ever before, but also in terms of bordering that was brought up. I'm glad that we are having this debate in English language, because the word border is both a noun and a verb, so it works better. It wouldn't work in Finnish. I have no idea about Polish how that would work, but borders don't simply exist, but they are actively maintained. They can be erased, of course, but at the moment we are maintaining them. We are creating new borders. And borders are not only at borders, right? I mean, our societies have become increasingly bordered, increasingly torn, increasingly divided. And I think we need to pay attention to that aspect of bordering as well. Bordering is very much about ordering and othering, the way that, excuse me, especially Henk van Houtum has been talking about borders. By borders, we create distinctions, which is pretty much a physical, a psychological, very important part of being human, right? That's what we do. And trying to link this kind of a broad argument here to the topics of today. And we heard earlier today from, during the keynote from Professor Elliot about anxieties and fear. And I think this is the key reason why our societies and the whole world has become so bordered now. Amidst this uncertainty that we don't really understand what's going on, whether it's polycrisis or whether it's something else, we are looking for easy solutions to very complicated problems. In many cases, as we can see in this continent, but elsewhere as well, strong state is being offered as a solution for uncertainty and anxiety. And many people are willing to accept that. And this plays out at the borders. I think anxiety, indeed, as Professor Elliot was talking about, it plays an important part here. And I'm very happy that he made a reference to Søren Kierkegaard and his work. And what I remember from my school days was Kierkegaard's statement that anxiety is fear that doesn't have an outlet. I hope I'm using his words correctly. But the very fact that we don't know what is threatening us is creating that anxiety. And trying to make this more concrete. I come from Finland. I come from Eastern Finland, right? And I assume that everybody knows what's eastern side of Eastern Finland, right? I don't see well, but some people are nodding, okay? Very good. So our border has changed drastically during the last years. And it has been really interesting to follow that. Sad, but interesting at the same time. Because that border is, and in border studies has been used very classical example. I think maybe one of the most studied borders, classical state borders that exist, largely thanks to Anssi Paasi's wonderful work for decades. But basically the whole nation of Finland was created on this distinction. We are a very young nation. That we are what our neighbors are not. We are something else than Swedes, and we are something else than Russians. And when we talked about the border, it was not really, whether it's somewhere there in the forest and whether we need a fence that is 3 meters or 3.5. That was not really the debate, but the border became a marker of identity and belonging. And you can remove the border, but by removing the idea of border in terms of identity was really to lose a part of yourself. So it really became this almost ontological question as a symbol of something. I think symbol was mentioned. And I think borders have become increasingly symbolic in today's climate. If we think about this, many crises have been mentioned today, but especially from the border studies perspective, the so-called refugee crisis, 2015, 16, what a terrible name, by the way, we can talk about that if you want. Then we had COVID after that, and now we have this very hostile war going on. And closing the borders have been basically offered as a solution for every single one of these crises. And it's interesting to think about how do we, especially in the case of the second one, COVID, which at least in the mediascape of Finland disappeared on the very same day that Russia invaded Ukraine. Nobody has been talking about COVID. After that, we can only handle one crisis at a time. But many of these issues that are profoundly, by their character and nature, does not respect borders. The virus being a very good example. I mean, I'm not a virologist, but as far as I can see, it doesn't really respect borders. But when we threw nationalism into that picture and we started to make these distinctions and closing borders for certain nationals, we Finns, we love Sweden so much that when the situation was worse in Finland than in Sweden, we still closed the border against Sweden because we thought the virus is coming somehow to Sweden. Right. Now, of course, we are dealing with, in Finland, very similar cases and problems that Poland is facing at your eastern border with Russian actions on the other side. And again, the incident last week, drones coming over, a matter that cannot really be solved by a border. Many of the borders that, and I link this now to my first sentence, I argued by saying that borders are laboratories, they are looking glasses or prisms through which we can see certain phenomena and challenges better and earlier. And I think that's the value of border studies, of treating them as a way to see things. Very seldom the things that we see at the borders, whether it's migration, whether it's downright warfare, whether it's something else, they are not ultimately border phenomena. And I would be bold enough to argue that they will not be solved by borders, no matter how tempting the idea of closing borders can be. It creates a false sense of security, convincing the people that we are in control amidst the uncertainty. But it can backfire at the same time, because it often hides the true causes of insecurity that cannot be solved by borders. I will stop there.
Thank you very much. I think there are a lot of issues that should be developed and discussed, but for now, thank you very much. And Elżbieta, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you, Katarzyna and Małgorzata and the others for organizing this panel. I think it's not always the case that sociology of borderlands is so present during the congresses of sociology, so I'm really very happy. Defining myself as borderland scholar or sociologist of borderlands, because we are talking in Poland more about sociology of borderland than sociology of borders, and it was from the very beginning of this subdiscipline. And actually my research career started with borders from the very beginning, because I wrote my PhD on memory cultures, as you mentioned, Katarzyna. Memory cultures in a divided city in Gliwice-Kozielec on the Polish-German border, and researching this at the Virginia University in another divided city. It's difficult now for me to say something new after you mentioned so many things I wanted to mention as well. And then being also with Dorte in the same research project focused on borders, B-shapes, But maybe I would try to summarize a little bit what has been said so far, but what I also wanted to emphasize. So when I read this question, I first of all thought it's good to think about the meanings of borders for whom, because I think different actors associate with borders, with the notion of borders, totally different things. So political actors, scholars, as we are, borderlanders, so people living in borderlands and experiencing the border or different kinds of borders in everyday life. Mobile people or migrantized people. And I think it's good to reflect on it, because then we will get probably different answers from political scientists, from geographers, from sociologists or ethnographers, and so on and so on. So there is no one notion of borders meaning the same for everyone. Observing and researching borders and borderlands, I think now for more than 20 years. So what in Borderlands studies is emphasized is this transformation itself of the notion of borders. What also already has been mentioned, that this transformation or the shift moving far beyond the traditional Westphalian model of a fixed territorial line of sovereignty towards practices and processes. So it's not about borders, it's also bordering, othering, and borderscaping. So the term borderscapes, to really reflect the complexity of borders, was proposed by Chiara Brambilla and other scholars, and now it's more about borderscaping as a process. As a process, as a practice, as a symbol, but also as a tool of power. Borders have become relational and multiscalar, not only seen from this top-down perspective of nation states and other political actors, but also from bottom up. And in my research, I'm also connecting now these two perspectives, because I'm leading currently one project at the Wrocław University focused on borders, on perception of borders, but also I have another project on migration, and we also focus on borderings. It's about young Ukrainian migrants in Poland in aging societies. So these two research fields, migration studies and borderland studies, are closer, and I think they really reflect this shift in the last years from borders as a line to borderings. But as Dorte already mentioned, and Jussi also, it doesn't mean that this territorial militarized form of borders disappeared, because what we can observe is a comeback of this fixed line of border controls within different kind of crises of disruptions. So we are very close to the Belarusian border here, and I think this also reflects very complex borderings, otherings, and racializing processes. What I would like also to emphasize is this function of borders not only as a barrier, which is very often the notion present in the research, but the function as a filter or a sorting machine, as Stefan Mau argued. So it's not the shift from permeable into impermeable border or borders as regimes, but these two functions happen at the same time. So some people, some mobile people, are privileged to cross the border, whereas the others can't not, and they are stopped. They are criminalized also in discourses, in narratives, in everyday narratives as well. Finally, what I'm interested in and what we are trying to research in the last years is how borders are constructed by different actors in narratives, in discourses. And this is, the focus is on how people construct the borders in their stories. So they are instrumentalized to define us versus them, to project sovereignty, to mobilize political sentiments, but also what was also mentioned, security and fear, belonging and exclusions. So I think it's not possible to answer your question with one notion, because borders are analyzed in their complexity, multidimensionality, and relationality as a spaces of interaction and interdependencies. And maybe I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. What's the meaning of borders in your approach and your research?
Difficult task now. But maybe I will try to be more specific and give specific examples. So I'm also, as you mentioned, I'm working at the University of Warsaw, but I'm also representing a research collective that it's called Badacze i Badaczki na granicy. In English, it's Researchers at the Border. And we were set up as a response to the Polish-Belarusian border crisis in 2021. And our role is kind of double, because we're researchers, but at the same time activists. Many of us, we were engaged in different activist action during the border crisis. So I will focus on the Polish-Belarusian border crisis, because although I have been researching migration for the last 17 years or so, the very 4 years, so since the crisis on the Polish-Belarusian border started, had enormous influence on my way, how I thought about and how I'm thinking about our borders. So today I decided that I will mainly focus on the Polish-Belarusian border, but I believe that this is, that can be an example, can be extrapolated to other borders. So when I'm thinking about the borders and the borderlands, something that comes to my mind is that in Poland, but also, as you mentioned, in other countries, the borderlands have been displaced. So what I mean by this? They were, by the bordering or rebordering practice, they have been transferred to our homes and to our interactions. So in case of rebordering of Polish-Belarusian border, it happens because it marked the line in Poland between government and uniformed service and those people who are supporting their actions, and those people who support people on the move who were against the government. And the symbolic but also real borderlands emerge in Usnaż Górny. Probably many of you know the name. So this is the village quite near from here in Polish-Belarusian border, when in August 2021, group of 32 Afghans were held hostage by Polish and Belarusian uniformed service. And the police and border guards, the Polish ones, they restricted access with humanitarian, medical, legal aid for many, many days to this group. And me, myself, I was in Usnaż. I was stood in front of cordon of police officers, and I experienced the border and the bordering processes there. So when I was standing there, there was enormous axiological gap between us. So we were all on the Polish land, but the division and the othering and being othered process happened there. But not to be only pessimistic, I would also add to our discussion the debordering process linked in Poland with the full-scale Russian invasion. So at that time, many Polish people were supporting displaced people from Ukraine. And the borderlands were transmitted from the Ukrainian-Polish border to our cities, to our homes. So in our daily contact with those displaced people, we were experiencing the thing which is, I think, really something beautiful in the borderlands, so possibility to interact with multiculturalism. So sometimes even in our homes, the corridors were kind of border between our culture and Ukrainian culture, and we were able to meet each other and to learn from each other. So I think in this sad world full of crisis, also there are situations like this in Poland with Ukrainians, displaced Ukrainians, where we were able to reproduce the borders and borderlands with this positive notion. So just to sum up, I think in the time when the borders are closed, you're mentioning it. The way to deal with insecurities, as you see, mention, is to put the border, to put the lines. Those two examples, I think, Polish-Belarusian border, but also the case of Polish-Ukrainian border, shows that we're just reproducing this richness of the borderlands in our everyday bordering practices, as Maggie also mentioned. So there are like small positive things about the bordering processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to be honest, I thought that the next question would be easier, but I think now it's getting harder and harder, because I would like you to explain how do you deal methodologically with borders. And I would like to start with Jussi this time. It's about emerging trends, how to research on borders.
Thanks for giving the floor and the most difficult question to.
You're welcome.
To me. I appreciate that. Of course, the challenge lies. I mean, we heard a lot about what borders mean today, but the very complexity of borders also make the methodological choices increasingly difficult. I mean, borders have not evolved from A to B, at least in my mind, but from one to many, right? We are researching various types of borders at the same time, and to grasp that complexity is very, very, very difficult. It's also difficult in today's context. And I'm trying to link this a little bit what we heard earlier today, because I think it was quite wonderful discussions in the earlier roundtable regarding the role of academia and how to apply your research in practice, because there are major differences what borders stand for. I mean, Ella, you said that borders are not the same for everybody, but we also use borders for different means. If you think about a very black and white example, but if you think about how borders are framed in a policy debate by politicians, which is a rather narrow way of understanding, because it's easy, it's effective, and we are living in a world where people are yearning for that kind of guarantees for their stability, whereas academic debate is going completely in the different directions, trying to show that borders are very complex. They are everywhere. They are increasingly emotional. They are not just rational. The facts are there, but they don't really matter anymore. So we need to apply different methods to study that, and that is, at least in my mind, a very, very difficult thing to do. The second is that when we deal with topics that are very charged, many things about borders are very emotionally charged, whether it's migration or whether it's something else, we tend to have rather emotional approach to that, which contrasts the rationality. a classic example. I think most countries in Europe, but I use my country as an example because I know it better. We are a country that are losing population. Birth rates are very, very, very low. There's people are living older, and you know, we can't keep the welfare society going because we don't have enough people in the country. This is completely understood by everybody, and it's even understood that migration is an economically beneficial thing for our economy. Even the right-wing parties agree on that. At the same time, we have increasingly stringent policies towards migrants and strong demands to close the border. And this creates this kind of paradox within how we need to try to apply our research. What comes out of this emotional landscape is that, and this also, I'm again trying to link the discussion earlier where activism was brought into the debate. And that's also within border studies, not just in sociology, but more broadly in border studies, quite often used to dismiss some of the research that's very activist type of research. So we need to be quite careful with the balance of being normative. I think there's a need to be normative in certain sense when we are, you know, trying to make this a better place to live for all of us. That's a normative stance, right? But our research methods needs to be very rigid, stringent, and objective. I do know in my work I assess a lot of research proposals, and quite often I see that I fully agree where this project is going, the normative angle, but your research methods are also very normative. We are providing quite one-sided pictures, and I fully understand where that is coming from because we have a very strong need in today's society to try to counterbalance the very narrow security-oriented debate. So there's this need that, okay, in order to balance that, I'm going to go all the way to the other end of the spectrum and trying to balance that. But that might or may limit the actual impact of your research because then it's more easy to be dismissed as an activist research. And trying to talk to the people who disagree with you is not very pleasant. I mean, not in your personal life, but not in the academic either. I mean, I did a couple of public podcasts. You can see them on YouTube with the members of one of our political parties who are quite a bit to the right. The True Finns party, for example, had a very open debate in the podcast. And I didn't really like it, but I think it was a wonderful experience. That was probably the first time that I was really trying to convince somebody who thinks fundamentally differently from me. And I think this is something that we need to do more. It's very often that we preach to the choir. We publish with the people that think alike. We are in the panels where everybody agrees on things. And usually in the audience, there are people who are nodding most of the time. And I think that needs to change. Not a black and white thing, but usually the audience that we are speaking to is not the part of the population that we need to convince. And I think that's something that we should try to do better.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, when doing interviews in Maggie's project, we encounter people who are totally different in their views, and that's the experience. That's the experience. So, Maggie, maybe you could say a few words.
Thank you. Yes. So I guess just a kind of quick recap in terms of, you know, borders are securitized, shifting, mobile. Borderlands are, you know, we talk about them, they're sort of in between, you know, the delimitation, borders control movement, they order, they're not static. So I think that, you know, borders are really complex assemblages, you know, where, and really drawing on Mimi Scheller's work on mobility justice, you know, where people, things, data, bodies, objects, representations are all put in relative relations of immobility with each other. And I think, that if we, if we're thinking about border as a kind of complex assemblage, then we need to think about the kinds of methods that we use to really sort of drill down and get a deeper understanding, both from the kind of top down, if you like, thinking about state-centric political theory. In the Irish border, for example, the Centre for Cross-Border Collaboration conference is going on in 2 days' time, but it will be focusing on trade and economics. But the life of the life worlds of people who live on the borders are really not present. When we present our project there, it will be. So I think it's really important that we engage in participatory, biographical, and arts-based methods, drawing on methodologies from the Global South, to really get a sense of lives at the borders, in the borderlands. And so in the project that we just a kind of quick account of this project, we're looking at 3 borders at the edges of the European Union, thinking about the way those borders have been really heavy focus, particularly since Schengen, but also in terms of the sort of turbulent, shifting geopolitics. And so what are the meanings of the borders? What are people's lives like there? And so we're writing a biography of those 3 borders from the ground up, really, using walking biographical interviews, narrative interviews, but also collaborating with artists as well. And this is a method that I've really I've really enjoyed working for many years with artists. And it kind of, I've described it as using the concept of ethnomimesis, so bringing ethnography together with art making. And coming back to my start in critical theory and the work of Adorno in particular, but art, the kind of transformative potential of art to say the unsayable, through the kind of playful creativity of the artist in collaboration with the creativity of the social scientist, with our training and so on. And so, our project is in its beginnings. The Polish-Ukraine border is probably the most advanced in terms of, the data. So we're looking at the Poland-Ukraine with Kasia and Agnieszka as leads, with Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And obviously since Brexit, the Irish border is an external border. And so the Irish border is the third border. But if I could just say a little bit about methods, and kind of having worked with these methods with artists, with filmmakers, I think what is produced can be really powerful, and that moves beyond the bounds of sociology, political theory, the interdisciplinary human sciences, into the lives and worlds of the people, of the public. And so in a project with a filmmaker, Jan Harkin, who actually was one of 2 people who made the Palestine Exception film, she joined me as Fulbright, and we worked with the group of migrants, women migrants in Teesside in the northeast of England, which is a very impoverished, it was a very poor area. And they were there because there was social housing there. But we used a sort of multimodal research, mapping, walking, biographies, biographical interviews, film and photography. And a collective story emerges about the safe zones and danger zones women encountered in their daily lives, in their search for sanctuary and belonging, but also documenting the oppositional discourses, their lives, the everyday borderings of their lives at the borders of humanity, but also their resistance and resilience in the face of necropolitics and necropower. Racism, for example, in that area is really extreme. So that the kind of what emerged was tensions between human rights, human dignity, humiliation, and their lived experiences. And public places were often experienced as safer than private places. So their accommodation, for example, and also the way that the border was really very much present in their lives. They had to sign on every week at the police station, which terrified them because it always meant that they could be detained and then deported. And so here the kind of hard edges of the everyday bordering reinforce their liminality, lack of citizenship and unfreedom. But their stories through this project told a different tale about the intersubjective intercorporeality and their enactments of cultural citizenship in the new situation. So rather than seeing them as kind of victims, the project was really about creating a space for their stories to be told and to be listened to. And also, that those everyday enactments of cultural citizenship, the right to presence and visibility, not marginalization, the right to dignity, not assimilation to the dominant order, and also the right to dignifying representation. So there's a they performed citizenship in the process of that project, made possible by the methodologies. And so I think kind of creative methodologies, together with, more kind of political theory, I think this combination, and you mentioned it, is it's really important because it gives us a fuller picture. I mean, it can never be the whole picture, but it gives us a fuller picture that we can address then through policy making, activism, kind of organizing. But also, making that contribution from sociology and the interdisciplinary social sciences.
Thank you very much, Marta. Maybe you could say a few words about connecting academia and activism.
Yeah. You just call for the disagreement, so I will a little bit disagree with you. So from my point of view, nowadays situation with the securitization of the border needs us to be an activist, researchers who are activists. And what I understand by this, so the process of doing research or the results of doing research should have influence on the reality. So for instance, my colleague from the researchers at the border, Natalia Judzińska and Inga Hajdarowicz, they're doing ethnographic walks in the border area. So Maggie, you mentioned the walks, but what they're doing, they're not only researching it, but they're also inviting people to go with them. And then this way they're showing them the situation. And also Natalia and Inga and some other people, they created interactive map in Polish and in English, where you can check what is in the swamp or how the wall was constructed. So this is an interactive walk. But I think we should, when we're talking about the methodology, we should do the step back and we should talk about the ethics. This is also somehow connected with this activism. So in our group, we're, for instance, just an example, we're really thinking how to talk about the border, what language to use, how we should speak. And maybe you have noticed it, I'm not calling the situation of the border the humanitarian crisis, of course not refugee crisis. I'm using the term crisis of the border because this is the exact translation from Arabic. Sorry, I won't provide the Arabic word, but direct translation, how about the situation talk people on the move. And also we're not using the term migrants, refugees, displaced people, but we're using the term people on the move because people on the move, they ask us to do so. So the language and the way how to do research with people on the move or with people on the borderlands, and how to be able to amplify their voice. And I will just give you one example of interesting research and methods. So it was Border Emergency Collective, and they, together with Miriam and Hamid, those were people who crossed the Polish-Belarusian border and eventually reached to Germany, where they got the refugee status or some kind of international protection. So they used something. They created a forensic investigation research called Zone of the Hidden Violence. You can see this video report online. Still, it's available. So they use spatial reconstruction methods. They're the mapping and the situated testimonies. So to give you an example, so they ask. They work with the graphic designer, and they ask Hamid and Miriam to tell them exactly where the building was, where the river was, how deep it was, and they reconstructed online in the digital version. And based on this, Miriam and Hamid, they were telling their stories. So told them where they were sitting when they were captured by Polish uniformed service, how the building looked like. So this forensic investigation research is something that allows to go somehow into experience of people, and they did it together with them. And the other, I think, interesting, maybe not methods, but the theme that emerged during our seminars is nature as an actor of the bordering practices. So we're inviting biologists, geographers. Like, I'm not going into specific like specialization in the biology, but those people who work in Białowieża forest. So this is national park. They were doing before the research about the bison, about the trees, and so on and so on. And now they're using their methods, so not sociological one, not the social science methods, but their methods, to tell us how the crisis of the Polish-Belarusian border influenced the nature. So, for instance, there is this video traps. So this is a small camera in the bushes, and when animal is crossing, it catches them. So they gave us an example that before the government started to build the border, there were so many animals, they counted it, and afterwards, during the construction process, there were less and less and less. So also using this science method, STEAM method, when talking about the border, it's something which I think it's interesting to be more engaged and start to do some cooperation between sociologists, ethnographers, and so on, with those people who are more into these STEAM sciences. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Dorte, if you could say a few words.
Yes. I guess in terms of methodologies, we are like also getting to a point where many of them have been mentioned now. But I would also maybe move into this discussion of normativity, or maybe I would rather speak about responsibility and responsiveness, because I think that a lot of the research that I'm doing is actually driven by this this call to act responsibly with borders, or within borders. And I think that the work that I'm doing is also trying to show that we as researchers don't necessarily always have the best answers. And this is why I'm doing ethnographic research, because I think that when it comes to borders and how to deal with borders, I think that there's a lot of experiences out there that can actually be captured, where you can really learn from how people are dealing with these issues. And I think this is one of the things that drives my research, is to actually try to find a way to learn about, okay, what does it mean to live in a borderland in a responsible way, or being responsive towards the other, the neighbor, etc., etc. And I think that we researchers don't always have the answers. And at the moment, what I'm particularly interested in, and the ones that I'm trying to learn from, are exactly non-human actors. So what I'm trying to do is also to look at the relation between humans and non-humans when we talk about borders and borderings. And I think this is a place where we can really, push our understanding of what borders are, because I mean we have this notion that when talking about nature is borderless, but nature isn't borderless. And when you do like this multi-species ethnography, or like trying to engage with the way that non-humans they border, you actually notice that there is a lot of bordering going on also in what we think is like borderless nature, right? And I think this is one of the places where a lot of natural scientists, they haven't really understood nature, but that's a different issue. But I think that this is also a place where I mean, if there was any space in all these, securitization discourses that are very noisy at the moment, if there was any space, then these discussions about environmental challenges today and climate change, I think this is one of the places where there is really a space to try to challenge this dominant border imaginary that is like stuck to in politics so much, because it does not make sense when we try to think about environmental challenges. I'm particularly interested in water and water borders. And as soon as I mean, of course, water and water borders, we are also drawing borders on water, but this is this is done in a two-dimensional way, right? When you draw borders on a map is two-dimensional, and if you really want to think about water, you'll notice that water is not two-dimensional. Water is multi-dimensional, right? So there's something happening under the surface. There's something going on. Water is not in itself dividing. It's actually connecting. It's flowing, right? And also there's something in the water. There are like life species in the water. Something is happening there, and it's not always like the best things that are happening underwater. But when you try to dive into other media or other elements, you'll also notice that, well, this like very one-sided, not very imaginary way of bordering that we are, or drawing borders on maps, is really not working for a lot of life on this planet. And I think that this is a place where we really have potential to push like the way that borders are seen as strict lines and walls and fences, etc., because it doesn't make sense when you talk about the movement of animals and things in nature.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Elżbieta.
And difficult task again. So I will start with disagreement with Jussi, claiming that there is a lot of debate on this complexity shift in Borderland studies, but I think there is no possibility to grasp the borders and borderings in their complexity. So we always take a snapshot of a situation, of a perspective, researching or focusing on borderlanders or some situations, some dates. I'm also applying mostly qualitative approach in my research, biographical narrative interviews, walking interviews, focus group interviews. But what I really learned in the last project was this very much participatory methods, and I liked them very much. We even tried to apply it in this Horizon V-Shapes project, the so-called citizen science approach, and it was very challenging and almost impossible really to follow the rules to include the research participants as co-shapers, as co-researchers. So we could realize only this to some extent. But I think this is the reflexivity, what I noticed in the Borderlands studies about regarding the research participants as agents, as speakers, including their voices in our research. But I think it's not enough because, okay, we try to record the voices, we conduct biographical interviews, we publish the papers, but how can we bring these voices and their narratives, their experiences to the broader public, to the media discourses, or to politicians? So I think this is the challenge, what I noticed, and I think this is a discussion ongoing in Borderlands studies, how to bring our research to the decision makers, to change the borders and borderings, to change the narrative on securitization. We are trying to do it, so it was a very interesting endeavor to translate the research results, the stories we collected with different kind of actors, minorities in Borderlands, Borderlanders, but also Euroscepticals. And then we tried to translate this into policy scenarios. And we developed with our Wrocław team a policy scenario on the future of Schengen, 3 kinds, and then try to test this with politicians, with local decision makers. And it was really very interesting for me to see how they work with these scenarios developed actually by researchers, but only us as mediators between the Borderlanders and them as those who take decisions. And I think this participatory methods and also this reflexivity on the position, on the role of researchers in this process is very much present now in Borderland sociology or Borderland research in general. The ethical implications of our research, and also how to make the voices of people audible, not just in our publications, because so who reads them? Yeah, to be honest, but also to try to use new methods to make them audible and to have impact. So Marta was talking about the impact of co-shaping, but I think it's very difficult task. We try to do it as a researcher, this engaged sociology as well, or engaged research. But the question whether we are really effective, I would be quite skeptical about. It's not optimistic. What is also very much reflected in methods is intersectionality. So to include these different kinds of bordering and othering, not only focusing on one variable, because they are really overlapping. And they are very much also conscious of people who are telling the stories. And I think this confrontation of the different narratives, what we also implemented in the project, just to analyze the media discourse about borders and Europe. We had a focus on Europe in the project, and then to confront these stories with people's stories. And there is very much divergence of this, not reproduction of these stories. And I think this, we were even surprised that Europe is not present in Borderland stories, although people live with the European Union flags and this presence in the city landscapes, but it was to some extent absent and silent. So to recap, I think this inclusion of borderlanders, different kind of borderlanders as our partners in research is the trend that I can observe in the last time, and what we are also trying to include in different methods. Also participatory filmmaking we did in another project. Dorte did walking with people, and story maps then as a visualization of the stories. So this is what we are also trying to implement and to make their voices more visible and more audible. Thank you.
And maybe add that we were also, I mean, part of the project is an artist collective as well. They were doing different like installations and happenings, and I think that the interesting thing about the work that they were doing was that it somehow it was a lot more normative than what the researchers were doing, and more confrontational, and they actually also got some very they were conceived as being very controversial by the public as well in certain cases. So this way of working also gave a lot of attention to the project that we might not have gotten otherwise.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. That was really fantastic. I was thinking also about how we, in socially engaged research, how we also engage with policymakers, with practitioners, so kind of wrapping them, including them also. And so just a couple of examples. And I love, Marta, your walk, the example of your walks. I mean, it's a long time ago now, but it's actually the first walking project that I did, probably around 2005. But we matched, a housing officer, education officer from a local council, with an asylum seeker, and this is the language we use then. But I love your people on the move. And the impact of that was incredible. It meant that, things happened in housing, it happened in education, because they met with human to human, and that, walking side by side, the attunement, the kind of emotional resonance. But another recent project using participatory arts and social and action research, we include one of the issues we discovered in the kind of biographical narratives, and the workshops that we did using theatre and walking, forum theatre, is that the kind of the surveillance and the policing and the everyday bordering by agencies like social workers into the lives of the moms and their children. These were moms with no recourse to public funds. And so we invited social workers in to do some forum with us. And that was really amazing, because we all learned. But we also had a dialogue day where we invited policymakers who obviously we would say yes to us. By this time, our participants were really confident, and so they led the dialogue groups, and it was incredible. And that led to us being invited to the House of Commons to meet the All-Parliamentary Group on Migration. And the moms delivered some theatre forum pieces, which were really powerful. But sadly, a private, a kind of private members bill was going to be brought to sort of challenge the no recourse to public funds policy. But then we were hit with COVID, so everything stopped. But it was, but really just that, kind of, that kind of the social engagement to include, at least to some extent, what's possible. That link into policy. In our project, there'll be a second level curriculum, so really kind of coming back to this morning's dialogue about the importance of sociology and critical sociology, not just for those of us at university, but, for kids in school. And so bringing the project to them through a second level curriculum to think critically about issues of these three borders and the European project. So it's kind of like, you know, but I think after so many years doing this kind of participatory work, you know, it's not it's not a magic bullet, it's not a panacea, and you take your wins where you can. So, but you keep on going, and you know, things change. Change happens slowly, and sometimes you get one step forward, two steps back.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is running very quickly. So my idea, if you allow me, is to combine two last topics. And let me put it this way. There are certain things and topics that are silenced, and there are certain topics and issues that are discussed again and again. And if you could tell me how to talk about the borders, both in academic and public discourses. Luckily, some of you started to answer the question, but I want to put it once again. And Marta, I think you should start this time.
Okay, so I think I want to talk about one specific thing which is not present in the debate. And maybe it will be controversial, but as you said, controversies sometimes change something. So from my experience on discourse analysis about migrants and border, of course, we know that the discourse was securitized, and migrants are, on purpose using the word migrants, are most of the time instrumentalized, right? So the governments, especially right wings, but for instance, in Poland, also the more liberal one, used the migration and narration about migration and to gain some votes, and the governments hijacked the figure of migrants. In Poland, it stands probably, as you can guess, for a young Muslim aggressive man. But I don't want to talk about this. I want to talk about the opposite side of the narration: human rights and humanitarian organization that also instrumentalize the image of people on the move. And what I mean by this. So again, case from the Polish-Belarusian border. In the beginning of the crisis, formal, non-formal, different groups that were providing support for the people in the move start to put photo on social media and in the more traditional media. And as you can guess, there were photos of vulnerable people freezed covered with thermal blankets, small children in flip-flops in the forest hugging their mothers. And of course, those images were telling the truth. The situation was like this. And they were the real stories, and they were there to raise an alarm, to make people to be aware of the situation and to get engaged. And later, similar images serve to raise sympathy for this for people in the move and to collect some fundings that were needed for humanitarian aid. However, and this is just an example from the Polish-Belarusian border, but same situation was with displaced people from Ukraine, and also before during different times when in Poland, when organization who supports migrants start to do something. So what I mean, of course, those images were telling the truth, but it was not the whole story. What those images were missing, they were missing people who have agency. So from the visual narration of Polish-Belarusian border, they were missing people who are agents of their travel. I have to mention the text of Alicja Palencka that was contested by many activists and some researchers. And in her text, she discussed the communication strategies that people in the zone use to pass it as safely as possible. And in her text, those people were not totally vulnerable and waiting to be rescued and saved by those heroes activists. They were navigating their travel as possible as they could in this asymmetrical hierarchy of powers. But they had agency, and I think we're missing this image of agency of migrants, of people in the move. And this is so what I mean that also organizations, people who are supporting people on the move, they're instrumentalize them. So they're talking about them, they're not letting them to talk. And they're, on one hand, they're putting images that contesting the anti-migrant discourse. So they're showing mothers and children, not young bulls, Muslim men. But on the other hand, they try to raise sympathy to gain some support. So I don't want to. So to sum up, I don't want to say that they're doing something wrong, because their motivation is something good. But I'm calling for more realistic image of the people in the move, because we're taking from them their agency, showing them, but not also letting them to talk. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think audience deserves some space too. So, Dorte.
Yes, what's the question again?
It's about silenced issues and topics and how to talk about borders within academia and in public discourse.
I think that at least how I understand what many of us are doing here is to, we are actually actively trying to kind of bring voice to something which is silenced. I think that's also part of this like responsibility or responsiveness, the ethics of what we are doing. I have to say that I mean, a lot of the time when we are talking about this, how to raise awareness in the public, how to reach politicians, etc., I find it really difficult to understand why it is we are not looked upon as doing this already. I mean, this is for me as a researcher, an academic, this is part of my job. This is what I do. And when I'm engaging with people in the borderlands, right, which is like borderlands in a lot of different ways, these people are also politicians. They're also political administration. They're also like these actors that we are supposedly somehow not reaching out to. So I think that in a lot of the research that we are doing, we are actually like reaching out to these actors that we are so, for some kind of strange reason, always speaking about as if we are not reaching out to them. Having said that, now that I'm working with issues of environmental challenges, I think this engagement with the local environment it's a lot easier to engage with politicians on these issues than it is to engage with political administration. I think that there's a clear distinction there, and when talking about climate change, environmental challenges, I think that one of the the areas where I would like to work more is this, okay, but how can we actually cooperate better with the administrations that also have to somehow provide some kind of change in these areas? And I find this is something that is very, very difficult. It's very, very difficult for the administration to break with some of their like normal ways of thinking about borders. So this is one of the places where I'm trying to say, okay, this is something I would like to focus on. And I think that, for instance, these like story maps, for instance, and using the stories that people tell as a way to get access to these people. I think this could be we shouldn't underestimate, the value of the methods that we are actually using, and how people could be interested in the methods that we are actually using. So I'm seeing that as maybe a way, like a different way of telling something to these people that might not be thinking in the same way. But still, I would say that I think that it's problematic if we are convincing ourselves in academia that we have not been talking to the public, because I think we've been doing that. That's been part of the academic tradition. I mean, it's also we're doing education. I mean, we are not completely like remote from society. I think this is somebody else telling the story.
Elżbieta.
First thing I would like to mention is this instrumentalization, which is also obvious, the securitization. But I think what we are trying also to emphasize is that this securitization causes or is a kind of vicious circle, causes insecurity or feeling of security, uncertainty, and anxiety, which was mentioned today. So maybe we should make also these producers of these securitization narratives that they actually, the result is the vice versa they expect, because people become more anxious and unsecure instead of secure. But I think what Marta said also is this kind of victimization of the people on the move, seeing and protecting them as victims for a good sake, as you mentioned, yeah, that just to get support for it. And in Polish debate, in political debate, but also in public discourse, there was this contrast between the narrative on the so-called crisis on the Polish-Belarusian border, and then this irregular migrants, or even the notion of illegal migrants have been used, and then the welcoming culture towards the Ukrainian people, war refugees. But I think in this narrative on Ukrainian people, there was also a kind of othering and racialization, because they were accepted because they are kind close to us. There are Slavs, there are white, there are women and children, so we can accept them. So in this this welcoming culture was also very full of racial arguments. I think what should be also more audible, what is not so discussed, are the borderings and otherings within, for example, the people on the move themselves. So what we noticed in the interviews with our Ukrainian research participants is the othering of the others, and a very strong emphasis on deservingness. So we deserve because we are working. So they try to fit into this political narrative that they are working, they are contributing to the economy, they're quite important, and they reproduce in their stories the same narrative. So we deserve, and these others are quite lazy because they do not want to work. They only want the social support. What surprised us a little bit is this very much myth of entrepreneurship. So we have to be independent. We have to demonstrate that we are so independent. We contribute. Therefore, we deserve. And I think they are quite not conscious about it, that they really reproduce the stories created for political sakes. And it was very interesting, and it is a kind of a pattern we identify in our stories with our interviews with young Ukrainian mobile people, because this is the focus also of the project, this deservedness and also this myth of entrepreneurship that we have to demonstrate. They want also to demonstrate something. And how to talk, I think it was mentioned already. So I think we should be sensitive, and we should try to make people sensitive with language. Language is very important. And sometimes we also reproduce some phrases, not very consciously, but I think this reflections is present very much, and there are a lot of articles on this, how to write about the borders and being reflexive and not reproduce this dominant discourses, political discourses, but also public discourses, because the media discourse is very much reproducing the political discourses. And it doesn't matter whether it is more conservative or far right, the liberal discourses is pretty the same regarding the narrative of people on the move, what I think Marta also is researching now. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Jussi.
Now it's really getting difficult to say anything new. I'm really happy that we managed to disagree a little bit at least, even though what I was thinking at that time was that, at least in my mind, activism and participatory research are quite different things. I'm not a sociologist myself, but I engage heavily in participatory. Sorry, losing my voice. Participatory research with the local communities in the borderland. That's basically my daily job, and then I wouldn't call myself as an activist at all. But there might also be differences in different disciplines how we frame these things. In fact, what has been surprising to me is that much of the narrative that today comes from the local community completely contrasts the ideas that I thought I would get from the border region, which is really interesting, because this is key part. I think should have said this in this previous question, but to validate our claims, academic claims, and then if we don't talk to the people who are inhabiting these border areas, then we are losing quite a bit. But that point became really clear already. So what is being silenced or instrumentalized? What comes to my mind that hasn't really been said yet is also challenging critically the claimed success of our border policies. We tend to have, now that we are living in this, and somebody said very well that we are always living in a crisis situation, and we tend to think that the one that we are living through now is the most fundamental one. But what I feel is that the room to disagree in this kind of political climate has become increasingly narrow in the political debate. I'm rather vocal in the Finnish political debate, and it's always whoever does that, that you say something in the public TV, and it's a fantastic thing to read your emails 5 minutes after that. People are telling you what they think about you quite a lot. Which is also part of the validation, by the way. But by far the most commonly used criticism or feedback that I get is to shut up. This is not time to be critical. That's by far the most pressing feedback that I get face to face and by email and various social media channels. that we are living in this moment of constant threat. And maybe this is a behavior of a small nation, but our strength has always been built on this very unified nation, speaking with one voice. That we are not big, but there's this very strong social clue that you can't really see, but it's expected to hold us together. And if you try to push back on some of the policies, for example, we now have this new border law in place that does many things, but also violates our own constitution. And to openly say that seems to be a taboo in this context. I mean, I said that in one of the discussion shows in late TV, and the amount of feedback that I got was insane. So we are now putting in place laws that violate our own laws. So if we are unable to live with our own legal framework, which is also a very normative framework, it's built on certain values, which we call European values, some of which are negative, by the way. They're all very positive values. So we are not able to live by our own value base and the legal framework, which we still demand others, especially the migrants who are coming in, to live by. And I think this is a challenge that certainly we understand that we need to take drastic measures in exceptional situations. I have nothing against that. But if we narrow down the academic debate or broader debate completely and say that those who are critical, and critical doesn't mean opposing, but it is probably clear here, but not often in the public debate. To be critical doesn't mean that I'm opposing it. I'm challenging the premise based on which certain policies is being made. And now it's being quite often framed in the border debate as almost unpatriotic, that this is not the time and place to be critical of the government. And of course, when you are somebody who gets paid to be critical of the government, it gets very difficult. So I hope that I think somebody, again, from the previous panel said that we need to be able to disagree in a sophisticated manner rather than make these attacks. So that is something that I think is a taboo today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Last word.
I'll be very quick. Thanks, everyone. That was really, really great. And it was something that Marta said in relation to humanitarian, those images, and it made me think about Julie Salverson's work. She talks about an aesthetics of injury, and that if suffering is consumed, something of its horror is removed. But also it kind of impacts really deeply on the kind of on agency, that people are agents of their own stories, directors, tellers, and so on. And so for me, it's probably like the only thing to add would be ethics, and ethics in action, and how we might collectively think about that. In my university, we've worked with. Really, as a consequence of working with community groups, we've taken up their challenge about working with academics to say, tell us how to do it then. So we've had a couple of workshops and two really beautiful kind of graphic illustrations of the workshops that we'll take to our ethics committee to have our ethics committee think through some of those, points and issues. But I think for me, it would be very finally, ethics in action and how we think about not only the morality and the responsibility, but what our ethics look like and what they, how we can talk about them, represent them, share them, but also from the perspective and working collaboratively with the people we work with on the ground, in communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really very inspiring discussion, and I think there are a lot of questions, and I think there are some comments. So maybe the audience would like to take part in our discussion, and yeah, there is one.
Thank you so much for this really inspiring, interesting panel. And of course, I have millions of questions and could ask them for 4 next hours, but I will try to wrap up. So I think that the topic that did not emerge for me, that was invisibilized, was the fact that borders are deadly. And bordering practices are pretty deadly too, because they involve not only ordering, but also policing. And I think Maggie mentioned that it's a necropolitical regime for increasing number of people. And when we talk about the necropolitical regime in the context of borders, so basically letting people die, drown, etc. At the Polish-Belarusian border, we have like 130 people who died, but Mediterranean is at least 30,000 officially registered. And I think when we think about the logics guiding the bordering practices and bordering scapes, and I'm not a border researcher, I'm more into migration. I'm wondering, like, because the logic of securitization that all of you mentioned, and I wouldn't buy into to agree with your own politicians, definitely, because, you know, fear mongering, the politics of fear is the logic that guides US politics since the 70s and politics in Europe since the 90s in many different aspects. And basically, it's becoming the most dominating trend. And we had the logics of humanitarianism that Marta described since quite some time, like using the notions of vulnerability, constructions of vulnerability, politics of vulnerability, to also police and border particular groups. This is disappearing. I think that nobody buys humanitarian narratives anymore, especially not our governments, I mean. We have seen the suspension of protections for the children benefits in Poland recently, suspension of asylum rights, basically suspension of rights that were a consensus. So I think what's emerging is quite different landscape or borderscape with just securitarian logic, necropolitical logic, with humanitarian notions, with human rights, just basically dissolving as a regime. So what's your response to this particular, because I think it's particular constellation right now, which is a bit different than before, and now the fear of war is making us remain silent in political debates, because why would I talk about migration if the war is coming, securitization, politics of threat? So that would be my question to you. Whether you see that something is changing and what would be your response to that? And I think remaining silent because there is a threat of war, it's not a good answer, not good enough answer for me.
Who would like to answer? You see.
I can say something. I don't know if it's going to be a good answer. Thanks for the intervention. I think it's an important one. I don't know really how to answer your question, but I'm going to provide a couple of thoughts, because what you're really talking about is basically the human cost of protectionism. We make policies that we know are going to lead to fatalities, right? And this maybe links to a little bit what I tried to say earlier about the claimed success of our policies. How do you measure success in this sense? I mean, it's a known fact by now that the external border of the European Union is the most deadly border in the whole world. More people die at the borders of Europe than anywhere else in the world. And if you think about the reasoning that we, whoever we is, you can decide who that is, we are using to boost these policies. They're usually value-based, that, you know, that these people are coming, they are not sharing our values, and, you know, as you were very much talking about earlier. But what it is that these policies tell about us, because bordering is not just excluding people outside, but it tells a lot about us that we are trying to confine inside. And the fact that we are in the situation that, more people die in trying to get into Europe than anywhere else. April 2015, statistically 14.5 people per day, right? that's insane. So if we use those very same positive European values to boost these agendas, I believe we are very much hollowing out the very premise of our policy. So the more ethical aspect comes through that direction. When we think about especially what it is that the Europe stands for, and I'm very pro-European, but I'm very critical at the same time. And we are talking about a political union that won a Nobel Peace Prize not too long time ago. How does that fit into the practices that we apply at the border? And how is this linked to the claimed success? Now we have, okay, we all know what's happening at the Mediterranean. I'm not going to repeat that, but we are seeing more and more also on the eastern borders. I mean, you know what's happening here. The Finnish-Russian case is becoming very booming topic as well. And how do we read into the actual developments of the border? We are now building a fence that is 250 kilometers long. Right? We haven't had anybody there in a more than a year, but we still feel the strong need to build that. And there was one person who managed to cross it, or actually go right by it. And there was a debate, what's the correct reaction? The one reaction is that, okay, the fence is not working. But what was the hegemonic, the dominant reaction? We need a bigger fence, right? So we are actually creating this vicious circle that, more and more we invest in border security, the more actually it demands further investments, because every time somebody manages to cross it, and somebody always will, by the way, it creates a further need. We see that, okay, it's not working, we need to invest more and more money. And it creates this circle that gets very detached from the actual cause why we are doing this. And if I would have more time, I would continue to argue that border security and our security, social security, safety as individuals are two very different things. There's no causality between those two concepts. I have no idea what you asked, by the way, but I'm going to stop.
Maggie.
Thank you for the question and the comment as well. Really important point. And how did we miss that? But I think this is why we do what we do also, isn't it? It's part of being a critical sociologist, critical migration scholar, to draw attention and to, I said earlier, to keep on keeping on, because we know that in terms of the kind of, I guess, dominant ideology or the way hegemony works and the way, that, every critical gesture is recuperated or neutralized. And so, we keep doing the work that we do to draw attention, to challenge, to resist, but also to collaborate with others to do so as well, which is, I think, part of that relationship between our research as sociologists, advocacy and activism. Thanks.
I would add one more thing to the disappearance of death in a public eyes. So, of course, people are getting used to that. There was first one, second one, after probably 100 or so, people stop counting. But also politicians did a great job in making us somehow not being bothered by the deaths. So we're talking about the securitization of borders, but we should also talk about militarizations of border. In Poland, we have this term of hybrid war. We're on the hybrid war. So people are dying on the war. The Radosław Sikorski, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, when there was debate about the suspension of rights to asylum, and there was a question about the women and the children. What about them and their rights to asylum? He said, we're on the war and people are dying on the war. They're like, war brings victims. We cannot do anything about this. So if we're on the war, everybody who is on the other side of the fence, they're enemies, right? So we have to protect Poland. We have to, of course, recalling the narrative, we have to protect Poland. We have to fight against those enemies. In my research with Mateusz Krempa, we tracked the discourse from the former government and this government is way worse because they're pretending they're not racist, they're pretending they're not xenophobic, but they're using, we called it militarized political correctness. So we covered all things that we're doing to people on the move with this patriotic notion and vibe. We're protecting Poland against Russia. So I think this is also the active role of politicians to make us forget about the deaths. And unfortunately, they're doing a great job in this.
Well, can I cover the other voice? Because there was a question from you, right? So here.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to ask my question. I'll be quick. So today, a big part of the discussion, all of the discussion was devoted to the borderlands, border areas, which are actually accessible for researchers, accessible for research. So we as sociologists, as border study researchers are able to go there or are able to speak with people. I, for example, come from the occupied part of Donbas, and I do my PhD research about the occupied part, and I have no access to that part. So my question to you is, how do we deal, or how do you suggest we could deal with areas which are inaccessible for researchers, inaccessible for objective studies, let's say? Thank you.
I have to be very cruel. We've got 4 minutes.
Can I just say that I think that a lot of the methods that we are using here can actually be a way to access, because it's also about, it's not just about the researcher having access, but it's people that have access to the region, right? So you can probably speak with somebody who's had access to the region, right? I think that was part of the point of a lot of the methodology that we are using, is that it's not just about, you know, the researcher and the research objectivity, and as in, well, you need to be there, but it's also about engagement with people who actually have experience from these places, right? So I would say that that would be a way of accessing.
Elżbieta, would you like to answer that question or the former one?
Yeah, I can only add the same, that you can find a gatekeeper that can provide you the access, not directly, but as a mediator, yeah, and you can then find enough sources, voices to conduct your research. But I wanted to add something to the previous comment and intervention. I think this discussion on violence, on surveillance, on identification of people on the move is very much present in the Borderland research. So there is this expression deathscape. I think scape is now very popular notion, or scaping. We have borderscape, we have landscapes, we have creamyscape, but there is also this expression deathscape, capturing the situation and the border that actually caused these deaths, what you mentioned. So coined, but if I'm not wrong, by Nicholas de Genova, who really tried to make conscious that border is today also deathscape. I headed this violence and surveillance, but you skipped one question, and I think this was therefore that we did not mention this very important aspect present in migration studies, in border studies, and in many other research approaches.
Okay, I think we have to finish, unfortunately, but our panelists are not surrounded by walls and are not armed. So if there are any other comments or questions, I think they will be happy to answer them. So I would like to thank you very much for that discussion, which was very, really fantastic. Thank you very much.